Montana Territory, January 1873. The ice cracked just before she went under. Keziah Thorne had been trying to cross the Blackfoot River, too desperate or too stubborn to turn back. Snow clung to her skirt and boots, the wind biting through every layer she wore. She had not expected the ice to break, but it did, and in a blink, the freezing water swallowed her whole. The cold punched the breath out of her. She fought, kicking and clawing, but the river did not care. It dragged her in, under, deeper. Her fingers scraped the sharp edge of the broken ice, then slipped. Her lungs screamed. Her vision blurred. And then, a hand, a rough, calloused hand reached in and caught her coat. She felt it strong, steady, real. He pulled. She broke the surface, coughing and choking, ice clinging to her eyelashes. "I got you," the man said, voice low and sharp with fear. "I got you, do not let go." He was already on his belly, half over the ice, half on the riverbank. His clothes soaked, his breath clouding in the cold air. She could not see much beyond the shape of his face, but she clung to him like the last thing she had on earth. The man dragged her out, inch by inch, until they were both on the frozen riverbank. Then he gathered her into his arms without asking. "You are gonna freeze to death," he muttered. "Not on my watch." She could not speak. Her teeth chattered too hard. He moved fast. She heard the creak of his saddle, the jingle of reins. Then the warmth of a horse under her and his arms around her again. She was not sure when she passed out, but she did, slumped against his chest, her fingers curled in the wool of his coat. Keziah woke to crackling firelight and the sharp sting of heat against her frozen skin. She gasped, trying to sit up, but a hand pressed her shoulder gently back. "Easy," he said. "You're safe now." She blinked. The cabin was small, rough-hewn logs and a dirt floor, but warm. The fire burned hot in the stone hearth, and she was wrapped in blankets, her wet things gone. The man knelt beside her, stoking the fire with one hand, the other bracing her back. He was tall, lean, with dark blonde hair falling into his eyes and a jaw rough with stubble. His face was weathered from sun and wind, but his eyes were a stormy gray, kind and steady. "Where am I?" she asked, voice hoarse. "About 2 miles west of the river. My cabin." He handed her a tin cup. "Drink. It is just warm water." She drank, her hands shaking so bad she had to hold the cup with both. The heat slid down her throat and into her chest. "You pulled me out," she said. "You fell in. I know what I did." He nodded, his face unreadable. Then he stood, moving to a shelf near the window. "Name is Boone Leston." "You." "Keziah Thorne." He gave a small nod like he was memorizing it. Then he brought over a folded shirt and trousers. "Best put these on once you feel strong enough. Yours were frozen solid. I hung them by the fire, but they are not going to be much good tonight." She looked at him, unsure. "Why did you help me?" Boone met her eyes. "Because you were drowning." She stared at the fire. "You do not even know me." "I did not need to." By the time the storm rolled in that night, the wind howled like it wanted to peel the roof off. Boone had secured the shutters and brought in extra firewood. Keziah sat bundled in his clothes, which hung off her thin frame, but they were dry and warm. He cooked beans and salt pork in a skillet. She watched him from the bed, too tired to move. Her fingers still ached, and her skin burned where the frostbite had kissed it. He handed her a tin plate. "Eat." She took it. "Thank you." Boone sat across from her at the small table, silent as he ate. The fire threw long shadows across the floor, and for a while, neither of them spoke. Then Keziah said, "I was trying to get to Helena." He looked up. "What for?" She hesitated, pushing beans around the plate. "Looking for work. And I had to leave." Boone nodded once. "Bad husband." "No husband." He did not press. She was grateful for that. After a long pause, she looked at him. "Do you live out here alone?" "My horse and a mule keep me company," he said, with a small lift of his mouth that was not quite a smile. "Been out here 3 years now." "How do you make a living?" "Trapping. Some timber work. Folks pass through sometimes and pay for help." "I do not need much." She studied him. "You saved my life." His eyes met hers, steady. "You do not owe me anything for that." "I did not say I did. But you are thinking it." She looked down at her plate, then said quietly, "I am not used to someone doing something without wanting something back." Boone stood and walked to the fire, setting his plate down. Then he turned, his voice quiet but sure. I wanted you to live. That is all. That night, she slept on the bed while Boone took the chair by the fire, wrapped in a blanket and his coat. She heard him get up once to feed the flames, his footsteps careful not to wake her. Keziah lay awake, staring at the ceiling. No one had ever pulled her out before. Not when her father left. Not when her sister died of fever. Not when the man who promised to marry her walked away and left her with nothing but debt and bad rumors. She had always gotten out alone. Until now. By morning, her strength was returning. Boone made coffee and oatmeal. She ate in silence, watching him move around the cabin like he had done it 1,000 times. He handed her a piece of bread. You still planning to go to Helena? She looked out the window. Snow piled against the sill. Not today, she said. He nodded. Stay as long as you need. I got room. Keziah looked at him then, really looked. Boone Leston had not smiled yet, not fully, but there was something warm in him, quiet and steady, like the fire that had not gone out all night. Thank you, she said. He met her eyes. You are welcome. And for the first time in a long while, Keziah felt something like safety settle in her chest. Not because she was warm or fed or wrapped in blankets. Because someone had pulled her out and had not let go. The snow let up by midday, but the wind didn't. It howled across the ridgeline and rattled the door like a thing alive. Inside, the fire burned low and steady, a hush hanging in the cabin like breath held too long. Boone stepped in from the lean-to, shaking the snow off his shoulders. His coat was dusted pale, his hair damp at the temples. Keziah sat at the table, mending a tear in her borrowed shirt with needle and thread from a tin she'd found near the window shelf. Her fingers moved slow but sure. She didn't look up. You eat yet? He asked, setting a haunch of rabbit on the counter. No, she said, pulling the thread tight. Didn't want to use up what's yours. You're here, he said. That makes it yours too. She tied off the stitch and looked over at him. There was something about the way he said things plain, without weight, but they settled deep anyway. Boone cleaned the rabbit with practiced motions, quiet except for the scrape of his knife. She washed his hands, strong, deliberate, scarred at the knuckles like he'd seen his share of fists in winter work. You trap full seasons? She asked, folding the shirt neatly beside her. Most years, he said. Some seasons are lean. Others make up for it. You always live alone? He didn't answer right away. Had a brother once. We came out here together. He's buried west of the ridge. Fever took him. Keziah's eyes dropped to her lap. I'm sorry. Boone shrugged one shoulder, but his jaw tightened. She stood and crossed to the hearth, dragging her chair closer to the heat. I had a sister, she said after a beat. Taught me how to thread a needle when I was 6. Thought she'd marry a doctor and live in a house with glass windows. Never made it past 20. Boone didn't speak, but his eyes lifted to hers. For a moment, the wind outside seemed distant. He set the meat aside and stoked the fire, then set the pan with lard to warm. Hard losing people before you get to know the whole of them, he said. She sat back in her chair. Harder when you did. They ate in silence. The rabbit was stringy, but she didn't care. Warm food was warm food. Afterward, Boone poured the last of the coffee into her cup and stood by the window, arms folded. Tracks out back, he said. Coyote. Might be sniffing after the smoke. Close. Not yet. Do they ever come in? He turned, met her eyes. Not while I'm here. There was no boast in it. Just fact. She believed him. She rinsed the tin plates with melted snow water while Boone hauled in more wood. Outside, the sun dipped behind the ridge, casting everything in a cold amber light. When he stepped back in, she was sewing again, this time a patch into the elbow of one of her stockings. You plan to stay in Helena if you make it there? He asked, pulling off his boots. I don't know. He sat across from her, elbows on his knees. There's work around the mining camps. Not easy, but it pays. I'm not afraid of work. He nodded once. Didn't think you were. She set the stocking down and looked at him. I don't know what I'm aiming at, Boone. I just know what I'm running from. His gaze didn't waver. Sometimes that's enough to get you started. She stood and stretched, her back cracking from the hours spent hunched. Boone looked away, respectful, though she wasn't indecent. I can take the floor tonight, she said. No need. You didn't sleep last night. Didn't need to. You always this stubborn? Something flickered at the corner of his mouth. Only when someone tries to be kind back. She crossed her arms. Maybe I'm not used to someone giving a damn without a reason. Boone leaned back in his chair, eyes on her like he was seeing the edges of something most folks missed. Maybe you just haven't met the right kind of reason yet. That settled between them, quiet and sharp as a knife laid on the table. She didn't answer, just picked up the mended shirt and folded it with careful hands. Later, the wind calmed. Boone lit a lantern and worked a whetstone over his blade. Keziah sat by the fire, her stocking half darned, her fingers moving slower now. "I'll get you to Helena when the road clears," he said, not looking up. She hesitated, then said, "I know." And though they didn't speak again that night, something passed between them, sure and slow as thawing earth that neither tried to name. The sun returned with quiet reluctance, edging across the drifted pines like it wasn't sure it belonged. Keziah stepped outside for the first time in 3 days, boots crunching into crusted snow, breath trailing like smoke in the brittle air. She carried the ash bucket, her fingers stiff in borrowed gloves. Boone had shown her where to dump it past the shed, near a hollowed stump where the wind didn't sweep it back against the cabin. She moved slow, her limbs still dulled by the cold that had nearly taken her. Boone's voice reached her from the slope behind the cabin. "Don't go past the fence line. Snow's thinner out there, but the ground's soft underneath." She turned to see him coming down the path, dragging a felled limb behind him, rope slung over one shoulder. His shirt sleeves were rolled, forearms streaked with bark dust. His boots sank into the snow's crust with each step. "I wasn't planning on wandering off," she called back. "Didn't figure you were," he said, setting the limb upright against the chopping block. "But a warning never hurts." She nodded, tamped the ash out on the blackened earth, and stood for a moment, watching him split the wood. His axe rose and fell with steady rhythm, blade biting clean through. He didn't speak again until the stack at his feet grew high enough to shadow his boots. "You ever do any riding?" She blinked. "Some, back when I was young. Farm horses, mostly. Mine's calm. Once the road's clear, we can ride double into Crow Creek. General store's still open this time of year. You'll want fresh stockings at least." She leaned against the post beside the shed. "You always plan ahead this far?" "If I don't, nobody else will." She studied him. There was no edge in his words, but they carried weight all the same. "You don't expect folks to stick around, do you?" He paused, resting the axe against his thigh. "No, not even me. I don't expect it," he said, "but I wouldn't mind it." Her breath caught, not from the cold. Inside, she hung the empty bucket back on its hook near the stove. The smell of pine sap clung to her sleeves. Boone followed, shaking snow from his boots before stepping in. "Your things are dry," he said, nodding toward the clothes folded on the chair. Still stiff, but wearable. She touched the fabric. The dark wool of her skirt had faded in places, but it was hers. She didn't change yet. Instead, she sat and began peeling an apple from the crate near the hearth. The knife moved cleaner now that her hands had steadied. "You always live this far off?" she asked. "Far as I could manage without losing the hunt lines." "Why?" He leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "Noise don't suit me. Neither does having someone 2 cabins away who knows what I ate for supper." "What about company?" He shrugged. "Comes when it comes." She held out a slice of apple. He took it without hesitation, chewing slow. "I used to think silence meant something was wrong," she said. "Now I think maybe it just means something's settled." Boone didn't answer, but his eyes held hers longer than they had before. That night, she took the chair by the fire and let him have the bed. He didn't argue, just gave her a nod and offered an extra quilt without words. She woke once in the dark, firelight low. Boone stood by the window, watching the night. His back was straight, hands tucked into the waistband of his trousers. "You hear something?" she whispered. "No," he said, "just looking." She shifted in the chair, the quilt falling to her lap. "You always stand watch." He turned slightly, just enough for his profile to catch the light. "Not always." "Then why tonight?" Boone was quiet for a moment. Then, "Because you're here." She didn't ask more. Didn't need to. The next morning, she found him outside, saddling the horse. The snow had hardened overnight, packed and clean, and the wind had turned mild. He looked up as she approached. "Road into Crow Creek's passable now. You ready?" She glanced toward the trees. "Maybe I don't need to go just yet." Boone didn't smile, but something eased in his shoulders. "All right," he said. "Then I'll bring in more wood." She reached for the bridle, fingers brushing his as they met. He looked at her, close enough to count the freckles across her cheekbones. "Boone," she said, voice low. "Yeah, I'm not running anymore." He nodded, slow. "Then I'm not letting go." The days settled into a rhythm neither of them spoke aloud. Morning came pale and slow, the light creeping through frost-laced panes as Boone stirred the fire to life. Keziah rose after him, shoulders stiff from sleep, and pulled on the skirt that still smelled faintly of smoke and pine. She braided her hair behind her back without a mirror, fingers steady. They didn't speak much while the coffee boiled or while she scraped lard into the skillet. But the silence wasn't heavy. It had changed shape, less of a wall, more of a space they both stepped into without stumbling. That afternoon, Boone came in with a bloodied knuckle and a hollowed look beneath his eyes. "What happened?" Keziah asked, setting the tin cup down without finishing the broth inside it. "Snareline caught a fox," he said, wiping his hand on a cloth. "Thing was half crazy, chewed clean through the bone. Had to put it down." She turned toward the basin with a kettle of warm water. "Let me see." He hesitated, then sat at the table and held out his hand. The cut was shallow but jagged, torn by teeth rather than blade. She cleaned it carefully, not asking questions he didn't offer answers to. "You never talk about your mother," she said as she wound the linen around his hand. He looked at her, brow faintly drawn. "She died in Missouri. I was 17. What was she like?" Boone didn't answer for a moment. Then, kept a pair of mourning gloves in a box for 10 years after my father died. Never wore 'em. Just touched them sometimes, like she was reminding herself she still could. Keziah tied the cloth in a knot, then laid his hand back on the table. "My mother left when I was 9. Took her name off everything, Bible, letters, even the mirror she used to keep beside the door. Like she never wanted to be remembered." Boone watched her, eyes darker than usual in the firelight. "But you remember." "I remember everything," she said. That night, she stitched a patch onto Boone's coat where the shoulder seam had started to pull. He sat across from her, sharpening a trap spring with a file, the sound rasping and steady. "You ever think about going back east?" she asked. "Not once. Not even if things were different." Boone looked up. "Things aren't." She nodded, then set the coat aside. A wind picked up after sundown, soft but insistent, moving through the trees with a hush like a lullaby sung through teeth. Keziah stepped outside to listen to it, arms folded, breath misting in the dark. Boone joined her a minute later, footsteps deliberate. "There's a grove east of the ridge," he said. "Maples, mostly. I go there sometimes when the trapping's quiet." "What do you do there?" "Sit. Think. Sometimes forget to do either." She glanced at him. "Will you take me?" He didn't answer right away. "It's not much. I don't need much." Boone nodded once. "We'll ride when the snow thins. Shouldn't be long now." She stood there beside him until her hands grew numb, her sleeve brushing his. He didn't move away. Inside, she laid her bedroll on the floor again. Boone didn't argue. But when the lantern was out and only the fire glowed, she said into the dark, "You can sit beside me, if you want." He didn't speak. But after a long moment, his steps crossed the floor, quiet as belief. He sat near, their shoulders touching lightly through the layers of wool and linen. Neither reached for the other. Neither pulled away. Keziah closed her eyes, listening to the crackle of the fire and the slow, even rhythm of his breathing. "I never asked you to save me," she said. Boone's voice was low. "You didn't have to." She didn't sleep right away. But when she did, it was without fear. The thaw came slow. Days warmed by half measures. Nights still sharp enough to harden the puddles left behind. Rivulets ran down the slope behind the cabin, carving paths through the snowpack. Boone opened the windows for an hour each afternoon, just enough to let the musty edge of winter out and the scent of pine needles and wet bark in. Keziah took to walking the cleared paths around the cabin, not far, just enough to feel the earth again beneath her feet. She found a birch sapling bent nearly sideways from the weight of the snow and propped it upright with a forked branch. Boone watched her from the porch, arms folded, saying nothing. That evening, she brought in the kettle from the hook outside and set it on the hearth. "You ever think about building onto this place?" she asked. Boone looked up from his seat by the window, where he was rubbing oil into the handle of his knife. Thought about a lean-to for tack storage. Maybe a loft, come summer. Could fit a second bed in a loft. He didn't answer right away. Wouldn't mind that. She poured water into the basin, steam curling over her hands. I never had a place that felt like mine. You do now? Keziah turned to face him. You mean that? Boone stood, slow and deliberate, and crossed the room. He stopped just before her, close enough to feel the warmth off her skin. I don't say things I don't mean. She searched his face, her own held still, but her hand found his without hesitation. I've lived under roofs that never kept out the cold, she said. Worked for folks that never looked me in the eye. I've walked away from everything I thought I needed, more than once. You're not walking now. No, she said. I'm not. That night, she shared the bed. Not from need or pity, but because the space between them had asked to be closed. They lay facing each other, fully clothed, hands resting between them. Boone's thumb brushed the back of hers once, and her eyes closed like something inside her had finally loosened. By the next afternoon, the road to Crow Creek had dried enough for a wagon wheel to pass without sinking. Boone hitched the mare and saddled her with a double blanket. He brought out an old pair of boots that had belonged to his brother Warren but solid and handed them to her. Keziah took them without a word, then reached into the pocket of her coat and pulled out a small, flattened pouch tied with string. There's coin in here, she said. Enough for supplies. I've been holding it since Colorado. Boone didn't touch it. Keep it. I want to buy the flour. He met her eyes. Then buy the flour. They rode into town side by side. The mare moved steady under the weight, used to Boone's hand, unbothered by the ruts and scattered meltwater. Keziah's arms wrapped around his waist, but lightly, like trust, not fear. Crow Creek was little more than a wide street and a clapboard general store with a salt-weathered sign, but it felt like more now, with him beside her. Inside, she picked a bolt of muslin, a tin of coffee, and a jar of preserves. Boone added flour, nails, and a wedge of salt pork. The shopkeeper, a man with a gray beard and a limp in his right leg, watched them both without comment. You're Boone Leston's woman, then? He asked as Keziah counted out coins. She paused, met Boone's eyes, then said, Yes. I am. The man nodded. Well, you've got a good one. Keeps to himself, but he's never taken more than he's owed. Boone lifted the sack of goods without a word, and they stepped back into the sun. On the ride home, Keziah leaned her cheek against his back and said, I want to stay. Not just for now. He didn't turn, but his hand found hers where it wrapped around his middle. Then we'll build the loft, he said, and I'll put up a door that latches from the inside. She smiled into the wool of his coat. That's all I've ever wanted. The days that followed moved with purpose. Boone cleared space behind the cabin for a garden bed, and Keziah planted the first row of onions with hands still raw from the cold. They stripped bark from fallen limbs and stacked them to dry. She mended the seams of his coat with thread she'd bought herself. One morning, Boone brought her a ring made from twisted copper and wrapped with a thin strip of leather. He didn't speak when he handed it to her. She slid it onto her finger without asking questions. That night, they lay close beneath the quilt, her head tucked beneath his jaw. I don't need to go anywhere else, she whispered. You're home, he murmured. Years passed, but the cabin never felt smaller. They added a porch on the east side, where she kept pots of herbs in the summer and dried corn husks in the fall. Boone built her a cupboard for her sewing things and carved her name into the edge of it. She taught him to bake bread without burning the crust. He showed her how to read the sky for rain. They never left Montana territory. They didn't need to. In time, neighbors came farther out, and the cabin was no longer the last post on the trail. But Boone and Keziah stayed just where they were, steady as the ridge behind them. And when the first child came a boy with Boone's eyes and Keziah's chin, he was born in the room where she'd once woken near frozen, wrapped in blankets not her own. Boone held him in arms that trembled and did not speak for a long time. Keziah watched from the bed, tears drying on her cheeks, and felt something old and aching finally ease. They named him Elias, after no one in particular only because it sounded like spring on the tongue. And when they sat on the porch that summer, their son sleeping in a basket at their feet, Boone took her hand in his and said, You're the best thing I ever found in the cold. She leaned her head on his shoulder. And you, she said, are the only thing I ever wanted to keep. They never lost that warmth. Not through the winters or the years that followed. Not even when their hair went gray and the roads turned to rail and the world shifted around them. They stayed together, steady, and loved. Always.